Can you spot what's wrong with the bride in this Nintendo's wedding picture? The discovery. Margaret Whitmore had always been fascinated by old photographs. As a curator at the Victorian Heritage Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, she spent her days surrounded by sepia-toned memories and faded daguerreotypes that whispered stories of lives long past. But nothing had prepared her for what she discovered on that crisp October morning. The photographer arrived in a dusty cardboard box, part of an estate donation from the recently deceased Eleanor Blackwood, whose family had been prominent in Salem society for over 2 centuries. Margaret carefully lifted each item from the box, cataloging vintage jewelry, yellowed letters, and an assortment of family portraits. It was near the bottom that she found it, a large, ornately framed wedding photograph dated. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical Victorian wedding portrait. The bride stood in the center, resplendent in elaborate white gown, with intricate lacework and a flowing train that pulled around her feet. Her veil cascaded from a delicate tiara, and she held a bouquet of what appeared to be white roses and baby's breath. The groom, tall and distinguished in his formal black tailcoat, stood beside her with the rigid posture common to photographs of that era. Surrounding the couple with their wedding party, and family members, bridesmaids in pale blue silk, groomsmen in matching formal wear, and elderly relatives seated in ornate chairs. The setting was clearly the grand parlor of a wealthy home, with heavy velvet drapes, an elaborate chandelier, and Persian rugs visible in the background. Margaret adjusted her magnifying glass and leaned closer to examine the details. The craftsmanship of the photograph was exceptional, with sharp focus and careful composition that spoke to the skill of a professional photographer. She could make out the intricate beadwork on the bride's dress, the delicate lace of her gloves, and even the small pearl buttons that ran up the back of her gown. But something nagged at her. There was an oddity, a detail that didn't quite fit with the rest of the scene. Margaret had examined thousands of Victorian photographs throughout her career, and her trained eye had developed an instinct for anachronisms and inconsistencies. She set the photograph aside and made a mental note to return to it later with fresh eyes. The rest of the morning was spent cataloging the remaining items from the Blackwood estate. There were letters written in elegant script, describing social events and family gatherings. A leather-bound diary contained entries about daily life in turn-of-the-century Salem, including mentions of the bride in the photograph, one Victoria Blackwood, Eleanor's great-great-grandmother. According to the diary entries, Victoria had married Charles Whitmore, no relation to Margaret, despite the shared surname, in an elaborate ceremony that was the social event of the season. The wedding had taken place on October 10 at the Blackwood family mansion on Chestnut Street. The diary described Victoria as a beautiful and accomplished young woman, well-versed in music, literature, and the social graces expected of a lady of her station. Can you spot the mysterious detail that caught Margaret's attention? Look closely at the wedding photograph and see if you can identify what doesn't belong in this Nintendo's scene. Before reading further, as the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself repeatedly drawn back to the wedding photograph. She studied each face, each piece of clothing, each decorative element. In the background, the more she looked, the stronger her conviction became that something was amiss. It wasn't just her imagination. There was definitely an element in this photograph that didn't belong in. She decided to research the Blackwood family more thoroughly. A trip to the museum's archives revealed newspaper clippings from the Salem Gazette, describing the wedding in glowing terms. The article mentioned the bride's stunning gown imported from Paris and the magnificent floral arrangements that filled every room of the mansion. It described the guest list, which included prominent families from Boston and New York, and noted that the ceremony was performed by the Right Reverend Dr. Samuel Morrison, a well-known Episcopal bishop. But even with all this historical context, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph held a secret. She made copies of the image and spent the evening at home, poring over every detail with a jeweler's loupe. Her cat, Sherlock, seemed to sense her preoccupation and settled beside her on the couch, purring softly as she worked. It was nearly midnight when Margaret finally set the photograph aside, no closer to identifying what had caught her attention. But she was determined to solve this mystery. Tomorrow, she would bring in her colleague, Dr. James Patterson, a photography expert who specialized in Victorian-era images. If anyone could help her identify the anomaly, it would be James. As she prepared for bed, Margaret couldn't help but wonder about Victoria Blackwood. What had her life been like after that grand wedding day? Had she been happy with Charles Whitmore? And most intriguingly, what secret might be hidden in plain sight in their wedding photograph? James Patterson arrived at the museum the next morning with his characteristic enthusiasm for historical mysteries. A tall, lanky man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and an unruly shock of grey hair. James had spent the better part of his career studying photographic techniques and equipment from the 19th, and his expertise had helped solve several historical puzzles over the years, and Margaret knew that if anyone could help her identify the anomaly in the Blackwood wedding photograph, it would be James. "So, what have you got for me today, Margaret?" James asked, settling into the chair across from her desk and accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Margaret placed the photograph before him, watching his expression carefully as he took his first look at the image. "This came in with the Blackwood estate donation yesterday. It's dated Minchlemtos, and everything about it seems authentic. But something's bothering me. There's a detail that doesn't feel right." James picked up the photograph and examined it through his own magnifying glass, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Interesting," he murmured after several minutes. "The photographic technique is certainly consistent with the period. The poses, the lighting, the composition, all typical of formal wedding portraits from that era." The photographer clearly knew what he was doing. He continued his examination, moving the magnifying glass slowly across the image. "The clothing appears authentic as well. The bride's gown is consistent with Mintos Wenton's fashion. The high neckline, the long sleeves, the elaborate train. The men's formal wear is appropriate for the period, and the bridesmaids' dresses follow the fashion trends of the time." Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "But do you see it? The thing that doesn't belong?" James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning every inch of the photograph. Then, suddenly, he straightened up with a sharp intake of breath. "Good heavens," he whispered. "How did I miss it at first?" "You see it too?" Margaret asked excitedly. "Indeed I do," James replied, his voice filled with amazement. "This is extraordinary, Margaret. Absolutely extraordinary." He pointed to a specific area of the photograph, and Margaret followed his gaze. There, barely visible but unmistakably present, once you knew where to look, was the anomaly that had been nagging at her subconscious. "But how is this possible?" Margaret asked, staring at the detail that James had identified. "This photograph is definitely from 1900. I verified the date through multiple sources. The Blackwood family records, newspaper accounts, even the diary entries, all confirm it." James shook his head in bewilderment. "I've never seen anything like this before. In all my years of studying historical photographs, I've encountered plenty of forgeries and manipulated images, but this is different. The photograph itself is authentic. I can tell by the paper, the chemical processes used, even the way the image has aged. But this detail..."
"It really does,"
pointing again at the anomaly. They spent the next hour examining the photograph from every angle, using different magnification levels and lighting conditions. James even brought out some of his specialized equipment, a digital microscope that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, and a spectral analysis device that could determine the age and composition of photographic materials. "The paper is definitely from the 1890s or early 1900s, James confirmed after running his tests. The silver halide crystals in the emulsion are consistent with photographic processes of that era. There's no evidence of digital manipulation or modern printing techniques. This is an authentic Victorian photograph." "Then, how do you explain the anomaly?" Margaret asked. James removed his glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. There are several possibilities, though none of them are entirely satisfactory. It could be a case of accidental double exposure, where two different images were accidentally combined during the development process. But that doesn't explain why this particular detail would appear in this specific location. He paused, considering other options. Another possibility is that someone added this element to the photograph after it was taken, using techniques available at the time. Victorian photographers were quite skilled at retouching and manipulating images, though usually for the purpose of removing blemishes or improving the overall composition. But why would someone add this particular detail? Margaret wondered aloud. It doesn't enhance the photograph in any way. If anything, it creates an anachronism that would have been just as obvious to people in 1900 as it is to us today. The mystery deepens. What could this strange detail be that has both experts baffled? Take another close look at the photograph and see if you can spot what James and Margaret have discovered. James put his glasses back on and leaned over the photograph once more. You know, Margaret, there's something else that's bothering me about this image. Look at the bride's expression. Margaret eyed Victoria Blackwood's face more carefully. The bride's expression was serene and composed, as was typical for formal portraits of the era when long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. But now that James had pointed it out, there was something in her eyes, a hint of mischief perhaps, or secret knowledge. It's almost as if she's in on some kind of joke, Margaret observed, like she knows something that the rest of us don't. Exactly, James agreed. And look at her hands. See how she's holding her bouquet? There's something deliberate about the positioning, as if she's trying to draw attention to a specific area of the photograph. They examined the bride's hands and the bouquet more closely. Victoria's gloved fingers were arranged in an unusual way, not quite natural for someone simply holding flowers. It was subtle, but once they noticed it, it seemed intentional. James, Margaret said slowly, what if this isn't an accident or a mistake? What if Victoria Blackwood deliberately included this anachronism in her wedding photograph for a reason? But what reason could she possibly have had? James asked. And how would she have managed it? She would have needed the cooperation of the photographer and possibly other members of the wedding party. Margaret stood up and began pacing around her office, her mind racing with possibilities. Think about it, James. This was 1900, the dawn of a new century. People were fascinated by the future, by technological progress, by the possibilities that lay ahead. What if Victoria was making some kind of statement about the future? What if she was trying to leave a message for people like us, who would discover this photograph more than a century later? Jones looked skeptical. That seems rather far-fetched, Margaret. How could she have known that this particular photograph would survive and be discovered by people with the expertise to recognize the anomaly? Maybe she didn't know for certain, Margaret replied. Maybe it was more of a hope or a gamble. The Blackwood family was wealthy and prominent. They would have expected their family photographs to be preserved. And Victoria was clearly an intelligent woman, based on the diary entries I read. She might have been forward-thinking, enough to imagine a future where people would have the technology to examine photographs in great detail. As the day wore on, Margaret and James continued to analyze the photograph, but they made little additional progress in understanding the mystery. The anomaly remained inexplicable. A detail simply shouldn't exist in a photograph from 1900, yet undeniably did. Finally, as the museum was preparing to close, James gathered up his equipment and prepared to leave. Margaret, he said, I think you may be onto something with your theory about Victoria leaving a deliberate message. But if that's the case, then this anomaly might not be the only clue. Have you thoroughly examined the rest of the items from the Blackwood estate? Margaret's eyes widened. You're right. I was so focused on the photograph that I didn't finish going through everything else. There might be additional clues in the letters or the diary. I suggest you take another look, James advised. And Margaret, Be very careful about who you share this discovery with. If this photograph really does contain some kind of deliberate anachronism, it could be historically significant. You'll want to document everything thoroughly before word gets out. After James left, Margaret returned to the box of Blackwood family items with renewed purpose. She had a mystery to solve, and she was beginning to suspect that Victoria Blackwood had left her more clues to find. Margaret stayed late at the museum that evening, carefully re-examining every item from the Blackwood estate with fresh eyes. The photograph sat propped against her desk, lamp. Victoria's enigmatic smile, seeming to encourage her search for additional clues. She began with Victoria's diary, reading each entry more carefully than she had the day before. The elegant handwriting revealed a woman of considerable intelligence and wit, with observations about society, politics, and the changing world around her that were remarkably progressive for the time. One entry, dated 3 weeks before the wedding, caught Margaret's attention. October 5th. Charles continues to speak of our future together with such certainty, as if the coming century holds no surprises for us. But I sense great changes ahead. Changes that will transform not just our lives, but the very fabric of society. I have been reading Mr. Wells' scientific romances, and while Charles dismisses them as mere fantasies, I believe they offer glimpses of possibilities that may not be so far-fetched after all. Perhaps someday, people will look back at our time and marvel at how little we truly understood about what was to come. Another entry, written just 2 days before the wedding, was even more intriguing. October 10th. I have made an unusual request of Mr. Hartwell, our photographer. He thinks me quite mad, but he has agreed to more what he calls my artistic whimsy. Charles knows nothing of this. Of course, he would never approve. But I am convinced that future generations will possess the means to see what we cannot, and perhaps they will understand the significance of what I have done. It is my small rebellion against the constraints of our time, my message in a battle cast upon the ocean of years. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was it, confirmation that Victoria had indeed deliberately included something unusual in her wedding photograph. But what exactly had she asked the photographer to do? She turned her attention to the letters, hoping to find correspondence with the mysterious Mr. Hartwell. Most of the letters were social correspondence, invitations to parties, thank you notes for wedding gifts, updates from friends and relatives. But buried among them was a small envelope, addressed in a different hand, with Miss Victoria Blackwood, written in precise professional script. Inside was a brief note, dated October 10th. Yen Miss Blackwood, or should I say Mrs. Whitmore, I trust your wedding day was everything you hoped it would be. As requested, I have prepared the special photograph according to your specification. I must admit, your request was most unusual, and I remain uncertain about the wisdom of such an undertaking. However, I am a man of my word, and the task has been completed as you desire. I have made only 3 prints of this particular image, one for your family album, one for my own records, and one that I have sealed and will keep in my studio safe, as you requested. Should anyone ever question the authenticity of the photograph, this 3rd print will serve as verification. I hope that whatever purpose you have in mind for this unusual portrait will justify the considerable effort it required. Your obedient servant, Cornelius Hartwell, photographer. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind raced. So Victoria specifically commissioned this unusual photograph, and there were originally 3 copies made. The photographer had kept 1 copy as verification, which suggested that even in 1900s, Hartwell understood that the image might someday be questioned. But what dared Victoria ask him to do? And more importantly, where was Hartwell's studio, and might his records still exist? The plot thickens. Victoria Blackwood deliberately planned this photographic mystery. What did you think she was trying to tell future generations? Study the image once more, and see if you can decode her message. Margaret spent the next hour researching Cornelius Hartwell. The Salem Historical Society's records showed that he had operated a photography studio on Fifth. The building still stood, though it had been converted into apartments decades ago. More promising was the discovery that Hartwell's business records and some of his photographic equipment had been donated to the Peabody Essex Museum. In the next morning, Margaret called her colleague Dr. Sarah Chen at the Peabody Essex Museum. Sarah was the curator of their photography collection and had extensive knowledge of local photographers from the Victorian era. Cornelius Hartwell, Sarah said when Margaret mentioned the name. "Oh yes, we have quite a bit of material from his studio. He was considered one of the finest portrait photographers in New England. Very innovative, always experimenting with new techniques. What's your interest in him?" Margaret explained about the Blackwood wedding photograph and the mysterious letter, though she was careful not to reveal the specific nature of the anomaly she had discovered. "That's fascinating," Sarah replied. "I'd be happy to help you research this." Hartwell kept meticulous records, and we have several boxes of his correspondence and business documents. "Why don't you come over this afternoon and we can go through them together?" That afternoon, Margaret found herself in the climate-controlled storage facility of the Peabody Essex Museum, surrounded by archivable boxes containing the remnants of Cornelius Hartwell's photography business. Sarah had pulled several boxes that covered the period around 1900, and they began methodically searching through the contents. "Here's something," Sarah said, holding up a leather-bound appointment book. October 1900. She flipped through the pages until she found the relevant dates. "Look at this. October 30th, 1900. Blackwood Whitmore wedding. Chestnut Street mansion. Special commission. Buoy requirements. Buoy requirements." Margaret repeated. "Victoria Blackwood's special request." They continued searching and found additional references to the Blackwood wedding in Hartwell's business correspondence. One letter to a supplier in Boston requested specialized materials for unusual photographic technique. Urgent delivery required. Another note, apparently written to himself, read, "Buoy commission requires extreme precision, must ensure proper alignment and timing. Client insists on authenticity of final result." But the most significant discovery came in a small wooden box that had been tucked away in the corner of one of the storage containers. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a glass photographic plate, negative. Attached to it was a label in Hartwell's handwriting, "Blackwood Wedding Special Commission. Original negative, handled with extreme care." Sarah carefully removed the negative and held it up to the light. "This is remarkable preservation." Glass plating negatives from this period are incredibly fragile, but this one is in excellent condition. Margaret studied the negative, seeing the familiar scene of the wedding party in reverse, as was typical for photographic negatives. But even in this format, the anomaly was visible. The detail that didn't belong in 1900 was clearly present in the original negative, proving that it wasn't added later through retouching or manipulation. "Sarah," Margaret said slowly, "I need to tell you something about this photograph. There's a detail in it that shouldn't exist in 1910. Something that suggests Victoria Blackwood somehow knew about future technology or events." Sarah looked at her skeptically. "That's quite a claim, Margaret. Are you certain about the dating?" "Absolutely certain. James Patterson examined it yesterday and confirmed that the photographic materials and techniques are authentic to the period." "But look here," Margaret pointed to a specific area of the negative where the anomaly was visible. Sarah studied the negative more closely, and gradually her expression changed from skepticism to amazement. "My God," she whispered, "how is this possible?" They spent the rest of the afternoon examining the negative under various lighting conditions and magnification levels. The anomaly was definitely present in the original image, ruling out any possibility of later manipulation or forgery. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made an unexpected discovery in the bottom of the wooden box. Wrapped in a separate piece of oiled cloth was a small envelope marked, "For future researchers." Inside was a brief note in Hartwell's handwriting, "To whoever may examine this photograph in years to come, I, Cornelius Hartwell, attest that this image was created on October 13th, 1900, using standard photographic techniques of the period. The unusual element that you have undoubtedly noticed was included at the specific request of Miss Victoria Blackwood, who provided me with detailed instructions for its incorporation. Miss Blackwood claimed to have knowledge of future developments that would make this element recognizable to people of a later era. While I cannot verify the truth of her claims, I can confirm that she provided me with precise specifications for creating this effect, specifications that require considerable technical skill to implement. I leave this record as testimony to the authenticity of the photograph and to Miss Blackwood's remarkable foresight. Cornelius Hartwell, October 3rd. They now had confirmation that Victoria Blackwood had deliberately included an anachronistic element in her wedding photograph, and that she had claimed to have knowledge of future development. But the biggest mystery remained: how had a woman in 1900s known about something that wouldn't be invented or discovered for decades to come? The discovery of Hartwell's note sent Margaret's investigation in an entirely new direction. If Victoria Blackwood had indeed possessed knowledge of future developments, the implications were staggering. Margaret knew she needed to learn more about Victoria herself, her background, her interests, and any possible explanation for her apparent prescience. She returned to the museum the next morning with a new sense of urgency. The Blackwood family papers might contain additional clues about Victoria's unusual knowledge. Margaret spread out all the documents on her desk and began a systematic search for any mention of Victoria's interests in science, technology, or futuristic concepts. The diary entries revealed a woman far ahead of her time. Victoria had been an avid reader of scientific journals and had corresponded with several prominent inventors and scientists of the era. One particularly intriguing entry from 2099 mentioned a meeting with Professor T, who had shared fascinating theories about the nature of time itself. Margaret's research into the Blackwood family history revealed that Victoria had been educated at Radcliffe College, where she had studied mathematics and natural philosophy, unusual subjects for a woman of her social standing, and her professors had described her as exceptionally gifted and possessed of an almost supernatural intuition for scientific principles. But it was a letter hidden in the back of Victoria's diary that provided the most shocking revelation. Written in Victoria's hand but never sent, it was addressed to my dear descendants and dated October 14th. To those who will discover this message in the years to come, I write to you from the year 1900, though I suspect that by the time you read these words, the world will have changed in ways that my contemporaries cannot imagine. Ye have been blessed, or perhaps cursed, with knowledge of events yet to come, and I have chosen to leave you a puzzle that will serve as proof of this extraordinary gift. The photograph taken at my wedding contains an element that will not be invented until well into the 20th. To those with the knowledge to recognize it, this will serve as evidence that time is not the linear progression that most believe it to be. I cannot explain the source of my knowledge, for I fear that even you, with all your advanced understanding, might find the truth difficult to accept. Suffice it to say that I have been granted glimpses of the future through means that science has not yet discovered. Ye have seen the great war that will consume Europe, the flying machines that will fill the skies, the devices that will allow people to speak across vast distances, and the terrible weapons that will have the power to destroy entire cities. Ye have seen women gain the right to vote, men walk upon the moon, and machines that can think and calculate faster than any human mind. But I have also seen hope, a future where knowledge and understanding triumph over ignorance and fear. It is for this future that I leave this message, in the hope that those who discover it will use their advanced knowledge wisely. The specific detail in my wedding photograph that has caught your attention is the letter became illegible at this point, as if water damage had obscured several lines. This technology will revolutionize your world, though it will also bring new challenges and dangers. I trust that you will handle this discovery with the discretion it deserves. The world of 1900 is not ready for such knowledge, and I suspect that even your advanced society may struggle to accept the implications of what I have revealed. With hope for a better tomorrow, Victoria Blackwood, Whitmore. Margaret stared at the letter in disbelief. The implications were staggering. If Victoria's claims were true, she had somehow possessed detailed knowledge of future events and technologies. But how was such a thing possible? The mystery reaches its climax. Victoria Blackwood claims to have seen the future and hidden proof in her wedding photograph. Can you finally identify the futuristic element that she included in the... Margaret called James Patterson immediately, asking him to return to the museum as soon as possible. When he arrived an hour later, she showed him Victoria's letter and watched his face go through the same progression of emotions she had experienced. Disbelief, amazement, and finally, a kind of awed acceptance. If this is authentic, James said slowly, and given everything else we've discovered, I have no reason to doubt it. Then we're dealing with something unprecedented in historical research. They returned to the wedding photograph with new eyes, knowing now that they were looking for a piece of technology that wouldn't be invented until well into the 20th century. Margaret studied every detail of the image with intense focus, and suddenly she saw it. James, she whispered, pointing to a specific area of the photograph. Look at the bride's wrist, just visible beneath her glove. James adjusted his magnifying glass and peered at the spot Margaret had indicated. There, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the outline of what appeared to be a small rectangular device strapped to Victoria's wrist. It's a wristwatch, James breathed. But that's impossible. Wristwatches weren't invented until when, and they didn't become common until World War I, when soldiers found them more practical than pocket watches. They stared at the photograph in amazement. Victoria Blackwood had somehow obtained and worn a wristwatch to her wedding in 1900, 4 years before the first wristwatch was even invented. It was a small detail, easily overlooked unless you knew what to look for. But it was undeniably anachronistic. But how did she get it? James wondered aloud. Even if she had somehow known that wristwatches would be invented, how could she have obtained one in 1900? Margaret had been thinking about the same question. What if she didn't obtain it in 1900? What if she obtained it in the future and somehow brought it back? James looked at her skeptically. Margaret, you're talking about time travel. That's science fiction, not historical research. Is it? Margaret asked. We have documented evidence that Victoria Blackwood possessed detailed knowledge of future events. We have a photograph that contains anachronistic technology. We have testimony from a contemporary photographer confirming that Victoria provided him with specifications for creating this effect. At what point do we have to consider that the impossible might actually be possible? They spent the rest of the day analyzing the photograph and the supporting documents, trying to find any alternative explanation for what they had discovered. But every piece of evidence pointed to the same incredible conclusion. Victoria Blackwood had somehow traveled through time and had chosen to leave proof of her journey in her wedding photograph. As the museum closed that evening, Margaret and James sat in her office, contemplating the implications of their discovery. They had solved the mystery of the wedding photograph, but in doing so, they had opened up questions that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of time and reality. What do we do now, James? This discovery could revolutionize our understanding of history, of science, of everything. Margaret looked at the photograph one more time, at Victoria's enigmatic smile and the tiny wristwatch that had waited more than a century to be discovered. We document everything carefully, she said. We verify our findings through every possible means, and then we decide whether the world is ready to learn that time travel might not be just science fiction. Word of Margaret's discovery spread quickly through the academic community, despite her attempts to keep the research confidential. Within a week, she found herself fielding calls from historians, physicists, and journalists from around the world, all eager to learn more about the Blackwood anomaly as it had come to be known. Elizabeth Harper, a quantum physicist from MIT, was among the first experts to examine the evidence in person. She arrived at the museum with a team of graduate students and an array of sophisticated analytical equipment. I've seen the preliminary reports, Harper said as she set up her instruments, but I need to examine the original photograph and supporting documents myself. If what you've discovered is authentic, it could have profound implications for our understanding of temporal mechanics. Margaret watched nervously as Harper's team subjected the photograph to every conceivable test. They used spectroscopy analysis to verify the age of the photographic materials, electron microscopy to examine the image at the molecular level, and computer enhancement to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. After 3 days of intensive analysis, Dr. Harper called Margaret and James into the conference room to share her findings. "I'll be direct with you," she began. "Everything about this photograph checks out as authentic. The paper, the chemicals, the silver halide crystals, all consistent with photographic processes of that era. There's no evidence of digital manipulation, modern printing techniques, or any form of forgery." She paused, consulting her notes. "However, the object visibly on the bride's wrist is undeniably a wristwatch of a design that wasn't developed. The proportions, the case design, even the apparent mechanism visibly through what appears to be a crystal face, all consistent with early 20th century timepiece technology." James leaned forward. "So, you're confirming that we have an authentic 1900 photograph containing technology that didn't exist until 4 years later?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Dr. Harper replied. "And frankly, I'm at a loss to explain it through conventional means." Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. The scientific confirmation of their discovery was gratifying, but it also meant that they could no longer dismiss the possibility that Victoria Blackwood had somehow traveled through time. Harper continued, "They've also had my team analyze the letter you found, purportedly written by Victoria Blackwood. The paper and ink are consistent with materials available in 1900s, and the handwriting analysis confirms that it was written by the same person who wrote the diary entries. But the content?" She shook her head in amazement. "Victoria describes several future events with remarkable accuracy. The Great War that will consume Europe, clearly World War I, flying machines that will fill the skies, the development of aviation, devices that will allow people to speak across vast distances, telecommunications technology, men walk upon the moon, the Apollo missions. The accuracy of these predictions is far beyond what could be attributed to lucky guessing." Margaret had been thinking about this aspect of the mystery as well. "Dr. Harper, from a physics perspective, is time travel actually possible?" The physicist considered the question carefully. "Theoretically, yes. Einstein's theories of relativity suggest that time travel might be possible under certain extreme conditions. There are several theoretical models: closed time-like curves, traversable wormholes, cosmic strings, that could potentially allow for temporal displacement." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "However, the energy requirements would be enormous, far beyond anything achievable with current technology. And there are significant paradoxes and causality issues that would need to be resolved. But it's not impossible," James pressed. "Not impossible, no. Just extremely improbable given our current understanding of physics." Over the following weeks, more experts arrived to examine the evidence. Historians verified the authenticity of the documents. Material scientists confirmed the age of the photograph, and even a team of forensic investigators found no evidence of fraud or manipulation. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her research into Victoria Blackwood's life, hoping to find some explanation for her apparent time-traveling abilities. She discovered that Victoria had been involved with several scientific societies and had corresponded with some of the most brilliant minds of her era, including Nikola Tesla and H.G. Wells. One particularly intriguing discovery was a letter from Tesla to Victoria, dated March 18, 1929. "Dear Miss Blackwood, your theories regarding the manipulation of temporal fields are fascinating, though I must admit they stretch the boundaries of current scientific understanding. The apparatus you describe would require a level of energy control that we have not yet achieved, though I do not consider it impossible. I have given considerable thought to your proposals, and while I cannot provide the technical assistance you seek, I encourage you to continue your research. The universe holds many secrets that we have yet to discover, and I suspect that time itself may be more malleable than we currently believe. Your servant in science, Nikola Tesla. This letter suggested that Victoria had been actively researching time travel and had even discussed her theories with one of the era's most innovative inventors. But it still didn't explain how she had actually achieved temporal displacement. The breakthrough came when Margaret discovered a hidden compartment in Victoria's writing desk, which had been donated to the museum along with the rest of the estate. Inside was a small leather journal filled with technical diagrams, mathematical equations, and detailed notes about something Victoria called temporal resonance. The journal described a device that could supposedly create a localized distortion in the fabric of space-time, allowing for limited travel through temporal dimensions. The technical specifications were far beyond anything that should have been possible with 1900s technology, yet the diagrams were drawn in Victoria's unmistakable hand. Most remarkably, the journal contained a detailed account of Victoria's first successful time travel experiment, conducted in September 1900, just 1 month before her wedding. September 15, success at last. The temporal resonance device functioned exactly as my calculations predict. He was able to project my consciousness forward approximately 25 years, experiencing the world of 1925 for what felt like several hours, though only minutes passed in my own time. The future I witnessed was both wondrous and terrifying. The Great War that I had theorized would indeed come to pass, bringing devastation beyond imagination. But I also saw remarkable technological advances, flying machines, wireless communication, and mechanical devices of incredible sophistication. Most importantly, I was able to observe the development of personal timepieces worn on the wrist, which will become common among soldiers during the coming conflict. I have made detailed sketches of these devices and believe I can construct a working replica using techniques available in our current time. I plan to wear this anachronistic timepiece at my wedding as proof for future generations that temporal travel is indeed possible. Perhaps someday, when humanity has advanced sufficiently, they will discover my message and understand its significance. Margaret stared at the journal entry in amazement. Victoria had not only traveled through time, but had deliberately chosen to leave evidence of her journey for future discovery. The wristwatch in the wedding photograph wasn't just an anachronism, it was a carefully planned message across the century. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. How had Victoria developed technology that was decades ahead of her time? Where had she obtained the knowledge and materials necessary to build a time travel device? And most intriguingly, what had happened to the device itself? The answer to that last question came in the journal's final entry, dated October 20. October 20. The knowledge it represents is too dangerous for our current world, and I fear what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. I have hidden the technical specifications in a place where they will be found when humanity is ready for such knowledge. Until this time, my wedding photograph will serve as the only proof that I achieved what others will consider impossible. I go now to my new life as Mrs. Charles Wetmore, carrying with me the memories of wonders yet to come. Perhaps someday, when the world has advanced sufficiently, someone will understand the true significance of what I have accomplished. The future is not fixed, and time is not the prison that most believe it to be. I leave this knowledge as my gift to generations yet unborn. The revelation of Victoria Blackwood's time travel experiments sent shockwaves through both the scientific and historical communities. The discovery was initially met with skepticism, but as more experts examined the evidence, authenticity of the documents, and the impossibility of explaining the anomaly through conventional means became increasingly apparent. Harper organized a symposium at MIT, bringing together physicists, historians, and philosophers to discuss the implications of the Blackwood discovery. The conference, titled Temporal Mechanics and Historical Evidence, attracted researchers from around the world. What we're dealing with here, Dr. Harper explained to the assembled experts, is not just a historical curiosity, but potentially the first documented case of successful time travel. The evidence is compelling, and we can no longer dismiss it as fraud or misinterpretation. The symposium sparked intense debate about the nature of time, causality, and the possibility that history might be more fluid than previously believed. Some researchers argued that Victoria's journey proved the existence of multiple timelines or parallel universes, while others suggested that her ability to travel through time was somehow connected to her exceptional understanding of temporal mechanics. Margaret found herself at the center of this scientific revolution, fielding interview requests from major news outlets and academic journals. The story of the mysterious wedding photograph captured the public imagination, with millions of people around the world studying the image and marveling at the tiny wristwatch that had waited more than a century to be discovered. But Margaret's work was far from over. Victoria's journal mentioned hidden technical specifications, and Margaret was determined to find them. She spent months searching through the Blackwood family estate, examining every piece of furniture, every book, and every document for signs of concealed information. The breakthrough came when she discovered that Victoria's writing desk contained a false bottom, accessible only by manipulating a specific sequence of hidden panels. Inside was a sealed metal container holding a collection of technical drawings and mathematical equations that described the construction and operation of the temporal resonance device. The specifications were incredibly detailed, showing a deep understanding of physics principles that wouldn't be formally discovered until decades later. The device appeared to work by creating a localized distortion in space-time, allowing consciousness to be projected forward or backward along temporal dimensions while the physical body remained in its original time period. Harper and the team spent months analyzing the specifications, trying to understand how Victoria had developed such advanced technology with the materials and knowledge available in money. Their conclusion was both fascinating and troubling. Victoria Blackwood appears to have been a scientific genius of unprecedented ability, Dr. Harper reported. Her understanding of temporal mechanics was at least 50 years ahead of her time, possibly more. The device she designed incorporates principles that we're only beginning to understand today. The question of whether the device could actually be built using modern technology became a subject of intense scientific interest. Several research teams began working on reconstructing Victoria's temporal resonance device, though the complexity of the design and the exotic materials required made it a formidable challenge. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her research into Victoria's later life, hoping to learn more about how she had used her knowledge of the future. She discovered that Victoria had become a prominent philanthropist and social reformer, using her wealth and influence to support causes that would prove to be ahead of their time. Victoria had funded research into aviation technology years before the Wright brothers' first flight, supported women's suffrage organizations before the movement gained mainstream acceptance, and invested in companies that would later become major corporations. Her investment portfolio, preserved in the family archives, showed an uncanny ability to predict which technologies and industries would prove successful. Most remarkably, Victoria had established a trust fund with specific instructions that it should be used to support scientific research into temporal mechanics and related phenomena, beginning in the year. The trust had been accumulating interest for over a century and was now worth millions of dollars. It's as if she knew exactly when her discovery would be made, Margaret marveled to James as they reviewed the trust document. She planned for everything, down to the funding that would be needed to continue the research. The trust fund allowed Margaret to establish the Victoria Blackwood Institute for Temporal Studies, dedicated to researching the implications of time travel and its potential application. The institute attracted some of the world's leading physicists and historians, all eager to explore the possibilities opened up by Victoria's pioneering work. As Margaret stood in her new office at the Institute, looking at the framed wedding photograph that had started it all. She reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. What had begun as a routine examination of historical artifacts had evolved into a discovery that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and reality. The wristwatch in Victoria's wedding photograph had indeed been a message across the centuries, a proof that the impossible was possible and that the future held wonders beyond imagination. Victoria Blackwood had achieved something that scientists still struggled to understand, and she had done it with nothing more than her brilliant mind and an unshaken belief that time was not the fixed progression that most people believed it to be. The mystery of the Nintendo's wedding photograph had been solved, but in solving it, Margaret and her colleagues had opened up new questions that would likely take decades to answer. How many other historical anomalies might be evidence of time travel? Were there other time travelers throughout history who had left similar clues? And most intriguingly, what other secrets might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for future generations to discover them? Victoria Blackwood's legacy lived on, not just in the scientific revolution she had sparked, but in the reminder that the past, present, and future might be more connected than anyone had ever imagined. Her wedding photograph would continue to inspire researchers and dreamers for generations to come, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the endless possibilities that lay hidden in the fabric of time itself. As Margaret often told visitors to the Institute, Victoria Blackwood proved that time is not a prison, but a vast ocean of possibilities. Her message to us was simple: the future is not fixed, and with enough knowledge and determination, even the impossible can become possible. The bride in the Nintendo's wedding photograph had indeed been hiding something extraordinary, not just a piece of anachronistic technology, but proof that the boundaries between past, present, and future might not be as solid as we once believed. In spotting what was wrong with the bride, Margaret had discovered something that was actually very right indeed, evidence that human potential knows no temporal bounds. The end. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction. While the historical details about Victorian photography and Salem society have been researched for accuracy, the time travel elements are purely imaginative. However, the next time you look at an old photograph, you might find yourself wondering what secrets it might be hiding in plain sight.